Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. My name's Danielle Wilkes. I'm the Regional Vice President for PJM Mid-Atlantic Sales for GDF Suez Energy Resources. I'd like to welcome you here today for our, it's going to be a great seminar with the keynote speaker, Andy Wiseman, that's sitting here next to me. The topic is actually electricity and natural gas prices this summer and beyond. Andy Wiseman, he's the editor-in-chief and also publisher of Energy Business Watch, as well as a senior energy advisor for Haynes and Boone. So with that, actually I'm going to pass it over to Andy. Keep in mind what we'd like to do for this is have you guys answer or ask questions after the whole presentation. So as soon as the presentation is finished, Andy will go ahead and take your questions. All right? Andy, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. I don't think I do.
No?
Okay, great. I really appreciate being here. I think this is actually a terrific venue. I think probably all of you could imagine the fantasies that have gone through my mind just stepping up on this podium and realizing the other people have been here. My sports career, unfortunately, is not quite illustrious enough so that it would warrant, it by itself would warrant my being here. I did share with Danielle as she was preparing her introduction, I offered to share with her my complete baseball statistics over the course of my career. And while it's true that I did unfortunately peak when I was about 7 years old, for whatever reason, she decided that we ought to focus more on energy issues than on my sports career, as much as I would like to do otherwise. But I really, Danielle gave really all you need to know about me. Basically, that I've been doing, I've been working in the energy industry my whole career. And it's both very intensively on the power side, very intensively on natural gas, and very intensively on coal. So I've seen a lot happen over a long time period. And I decided about 14 years ago to start an advisory service called EBW Analytics Group that looks intensely at the electricity and natural gas group markets. And I should emphasize at the outset, what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts about where the market is heading. They're strictly my thoughts. GDF Suez maintains a position that's market neutral, but I've been working with GDF Suez for a number of years, and what I really admire a great deal with the way GDF Suez approaches issues is that it really puts a strong emphasis on trying to provide the best information possible to try to assist its customers. And I'm basically arranging for me to put on programs like this is one of many things that GDF Suez does to serve that end. And from my perspective, it's something I welcome very much, really for a very specific reason. Which is that I feel generally the reason I got involved we have a publication now that's called Energy Risk Report that we actually have an exclusive distribution arrangement with GDF Suez and a special rate for all of you or anyone else who is interested in subscribing through GDF Suez that looks at the markets in the electricity markets and the natural gas markets in depth. And the reason I've been interested in pursuing all this is that I feel essentially that the community of people like me, energy analysts, hasn't done as good a job as we should in trying to assist you in a fairly difficult task. All of you, know what it's like to have to make decisions about when to pull the trigger on energy procurement decisions. And reason I've gotten involved in this over the years is that I feel really fairly passionately that I need to do, that I want to try to do everything that I can, based upon the experience I've had over the years, to make your jobs easier, to try to give you as much insight as possible as to where the market might head. And from my perspective, I really appreciate the opportunity that GDF Suez provides to me to appear before groups like this and to share whatever insights that I have, in the hope that it'll be helpful to you in your procurement decisions. And what I'm going to do today is that I'm going to try to focus basically on three kind of general areas. One, everything I'm going to say is really directed at prices over the next 3 to 4 years, particularly 2015, 2016, 2017, for both electricity and natural gas. I'm going to focus a portion of what I have to say about lessons learned from last winter, because I think last winter really did teach us a lot and highlight for all of us some of the risks that exist with respect to the electricity and natural gas markets. And then I'm going to talk about some longer-term trends that affect procurement decisions. And I'm going to some extent, put issues in a national context, but mainly focus on PJM, in particular on the assumption that that's what's primarily of interest to most of you. And from my standpoint, what we're trying to do, both in presentations like this and in the publication that we put out, is basically to try to give you our thoughts, to try to give you as much guidance as we can as to the timing of procurement decisions, and to try to provide a more in-depth, more rigorous, objective basis for decision making. And from our standpoint, in terms of what we emphasize, in terms of the way we look at the market, we do think that it is possible, and actually we have a pretty good track record of predicting major shifts in energy prices several months before they occur. And I wouldn't want to claim, I don't think anyone should properly claim, that I can tell you for sure tomorrow what will happen tomorrow in the futures market for PJM or for prices at Henry Hub. But I do think that to a greater degree than many assume, that it is possible to give pretty good insights, both as to what's most likely to occur and as to what the major risk factors are and what that means in practical terms, in terms of when the benefits are sufficiently clear-cut and or the risks of not acting sufficiently large that it would be a mistake to delay acting. And in terms of how we approach the market in order to be able to do that, we emphasize basically 5 things. One that you'll see a lot of this afternoon is to really step back and understand the big picture in terms of what is affecting the market and what's creating potential risks. Secondly, absolutely key factor, we think, is to be able to really understand in a rigorous way what the risks are of deviations from normal weather, and to be able to anticipate those and take those into account in your procurement decisions. Third, we've developed a lot of new analytical tools that actually allow us with quite a bit of confidence to predict where prices are likely to be under any given set of assumptions regarding what the weather will be. And fourth, that we think is critical now and is going to become increasingly important over time, is to understand regulatory changes that are going to occur and how they affect the market. And finally, kind of the cornerstone of the way we approach the market in my presentation today is to really focus very heavily on what the risk factors are in terms of upside price risks and try to take those into account in your procurement decision, because as I suspect every one of you is well aware, and as we saw fairly dramatically last winter, the nature of the electricity market and the natural gas market is that there are almost no upside limits. When bad things happen, they can be very bad. And so we think it is, we try to look for the most favorable buying opportunities in the market, but we think rather than trying to time the market perfectly, that the most important thing to do really is to be very heavily focused on the factors that could drive prices significantly higher, and to protect yourself and your company against the potential to be exposed to price increases. And as we'll see, we think that actually leads to kind of clear, actionable recommendations right now. Because as I'll go through in more detail, we think that pretty clearly right now, over the period of just the next perhaps 6-8 weeks or so, that there is and will continue to be a particularly good buying opportunity. That we're at a point where prices, all the way out 3-4 years down the strip in PJM, we think are already really pretty attractive and may become slightly more attractive over the course of the next several weeks, and that there are scenarios and there is the potential that there will be times when prices will drop even lower, but we think it's in part because of that we always recommend a portfolio approach of not necessarily planning to cover all of your requirements in any one point in time, but we think we're pretty clearly at a point right now where over the next several weeks the prices will be favorable, and that there are significant risks that as soon as late September or early October, prices could go up quite a bit. And again, I'm not talking about just what the daily prices might be. I'm talking about the strip going actually several years out in time, and I'll put up several graphs that will show you precisely the basis for that conclusion. And we think that kind of highlights a broader general message, which is that we're really moving into a period now where right now we think that there is a long list of risk factors that create the potential for significant price spikes and for the long-term price curves to move up significantly over time, that are really either not reflected at all in the market or barely priced in at all. And that we think is really important to be aware of, because we think this is a time period in which it is beneficial to think about covering at least a significant portion of your requirements further out in time than might have been the case historically. And I'll just tick off the risk factors very quickly now, and I won't cover all of these in depth during the presentation, but I'll just cover a number of them in some significant depth as they apply both to the winter strips and the summer strips. And one factor that I'll just tick off quickly is what we are clearly seeing, and one can debate the causes and exactly why it's occurring, but we are clearly seeing a significant increase in the frequency of extreme weather events. And sometimes that might result in much milder than normal demand, mild winters or cool summers like we're having now, and that can lead to some downside movement in prices. But it also definitely, we saw it last winter and we've seen it now several times, where essentially what happens is that we have much higher weather-driven demand, and it can cause very significant price spikes. And we think that essentially one needs to be cognizant of that in thinking about procurement decisions, that the risk that whatever we might say or anyone else might say about what expected price levels might be under a normal weather scenario, that the risk that we will have extreme weather and that it will result in prices going up sharply is going to be there continuously, and that is a major factor that says basically that when we get into periods like what we think exists now, where prices are fairly favorable, that it's important to take advantage of that just to avoid being exposed to the periods when suddenly prices shoot way up. So that's important. As I'll explain a little bit there, part of what we saw this past winter in PJM and other regions is that essentially the market overseers, essentially have been for some years now been essentially making some mistakes in which it could cause them to underestimate the exposure to price spikes. And we'll talk about that more in the context of PJM, but basically, part of what happened this winter is that when the cold weather hit, it resulted in, as probably all of you are aware, a lot of generating units being out of service, and in the inability to deliver sufficient natural gas to a lot of the gas-fired plants in PJM. And we think those were actually things that one should have recognized in advance, and PJM has acknowledged at this point and has gone back and has acknowledged that it didn't do a good enough job from an analysis standpoint in anticipating the likelihood, the risk of coincident events of several bad things happening at once, and that it should have recognized that, and that is a risk going forward that again increases the exposure to upside price spikes. Another huge factor all around the country, but particularly in PJM, is all the coal-fired plants that are expected to be retired, and that also we think is not yet fully priced into the market. There are also issues about what's going to happen to long-term demand for natural gas and how that will affect natural gas prices. Just a long list of significant factors, all of which are critical in thinking about the timing of procurement decisions and the benefits of a portfolio approach, and most of which involve factors that basically increase the potential to exposure to price spikes or to a significant uplift, rise in the forward curve down the road. So we're going to talk about that. And the bottom line with the bullets below is that those are the factors that in our mind are particularly important and gravitate strongly in terms of the benefits of following a portfolio approach and looking for times when prices clearly seem to be relatively favorable, maybe even very favorable, but at least relatively favorable, in covering a portion of your requirements out for a period of several years when those opportunities arise, as is occurring now, in order to reduce your company's exposure to all these risk factors that loom down the road. And near term, it's really kind of interesting because the energy markets are, as all of you know, they're really complex. And I was indicating to Danielle ahead of time, I sometimes put on 3-day programs just talking about in greater depth about some of the issues that we're going to cover today. So there's no shortage of complexity. But at the same time, when you step back, there are some things that are actually pretty clear cut that don't even necessarily require that one dive into as much complexity as people like me are often prone to do. And we're kind of in a situation like that right now, where when you look at, let's just step back and let's look at what's happened both in PJM and much of the country over the first 7.5 months of this year. And what happened initially is that for reasons that probably all of you are familiar with, we had incredible price spikes in this past winter. And graphs at the bottom here. Make sure I pick the pointer button, but show that in PJM the spot market price for natural gas on the worst day got up above $120 per million BTU. A price that I think we'd seen prices that high once before in New England. I don't think we'd ever seen them that high before in PJM. And in parallel with that, we saw the spot market prices for electricity go up to the highest levels that we'd ever seen before in the winter. And as all you know all too well, that anytime any electricity user or natural gas user hasn't previously covered their position and is still exposed to market prices, and you get these kinds of price spikes, you can spend more in 3 days of very cold weather. It can cost you more for energy than it would ordinarily cost you in a month. So obviously these kinds of events are critical in terms of protecting against price risks. What's interesting, and the part of the story that really can be explained fairly simply, is this. What happened? When these high prices occurred last winter, the near-term prices, daily prices, went extremely high. That's what you would expect. That was at least in substantial part due to extreme cold weather and conditions that may or may not ever occur with quite the same severity in the future. But what happened is not only did near-term, daily prices go up sharply, but essentially that triggered a process where both for the winter month contracts going out all the way down the forward curve, and I put up here 2015, next winter, the winter thereafter, and one more down the road, and for the summer, going several years out of time, the future strip went way up. And so, if you look, I guess the black line is next winter. Heading into the winter, prices were basically in the low 40s per megawatt hour. And they wound up climbing once the cold weather hit, and then the price spikes. They actually continued all the way out through May. We saw the winter month strip for next winter go way up, and for the winter thereafter go way up, and for even further down the road, we saw prices all go way up. And that, to some degree, makes sense because what we were seeing for the first time is that the exposure to price increases in the winter months was much greater than most people recognized that it was in the past. So you can, to that degree, it made sense for the curves to shift upward through this whole time period. But they didn't just shift up a little bit, they skyrocketed. And both at the time and particularly with the benefit of hindsight, that even though we were talking about buying electricity 3 years out, essentially that probably was an overreaction. The other factor, in terms of just highlighting the psychological impact and the market sentiment impact here, is that the impact on the summer month contracts, where basically the problems that occurred last winter are not quite as directly applicable. The winter impact on the summer month contracts going several years out was almost as sharp. You again saw a very steep increase in prices, and in both instances, that we thought at the time, and I think subsequent events have validated, was partially just kind of a too strong reaction to the events that occurred last winter. And that's kind of the first part of the story. But the second part that starts to make it really interesting is that what's happened since then. And the short version of it is that what's happened since then is that we had this extremely severe cold winter followed by an extremely, a much milder than normal summer. And you see this is nationally total CDDs this summer. And basically, as you can see, it's way below what has occurred frequently in the past and close to the lowest in the last decade. And that occurred at the same time that a number of other things that were happening in the market. And partly because of that, we started with a record natural gas storage deficit, and we've actually been able to whittle that down quite rapidly. And what's happened that's important for present purposes is that now that we've had this experience where what happened this summer was unquestionably due in significant part to kind of the good fortune of having very mild weather and to some other circumstances that may not persist indefinitely over time that I'll talk about more as we go into this in more detail, is that we've seen prices for both going several years out in time for both the winter month contracts and the summer month contracts after peaking in May have dropped off extremely rapidly, and the summer month contracts are now actually near the lowest point that they've been at for the last 12 months. And the winter month contracts, we would not have expected to fall off as sharply as the summer month contracts, because we really did all learn something this winter in terms of there being increased winter risks of price spikes in the winter, but they also have fallen off to a level that's kind of is close to what they were early in the price run-up, and essentially $12, $14 per megawatt hour below where they were at the peak. And that analysis, from our standpoint, it doesn't tell you automatically that means that this is a very good time to buy. There are other factors that also have to be taken into account, and I'll go into those in more depth as I continue the presentation. But it certainly is really strongly suggestive, that it follows a consistent pattern. And the consistent pattern, it's, again, this is the question of stepping back and looking at the big picture, is that what the market does time after time after time is that when we have these extreme weather events or other special factors that either cause prices to go particularly high or particularly low, it tends to overreact. It tends to, in terms of what happens to the long-term curve, that prices tend to go up higher when we have extremely high weather demand, that the long-term curve going many years out down the road tends to increase more than it probably should. And when we have circumstances like we've had this summer, where essentially everything is lined up and we've had some particularly favorable conditions, the long-term curve tends to drop more than probably in our judgment, at least this time around in particular, than it reasonably should. And so, this set of factors, before we even go into the risk factors in more detail, this pattern that I've described in the market, we think itself, goes a long way down the road to saying this really is a time that one ought to be looking very carefully at making procurement decisions, not just for the rest of this year, where most of you are probably covered, or even for next year, but that if we look for the next several years for both the winter and the summer month contracts, that prices have dropped to levels that look fairly attractive. And as I go further into the presentation and talk about the other risk factors, actually wind up looking very attractive. That what makes the timing right now particularly important is that this set of situations where the market to some degree may have overreacted to the favorable conditions this summer isn't necessarily going to last indefinitely. Instead, there's a significant risk that what will happen is just the opposite. And in particular, when we look at the weather and weather-related risks, it is pretty clear now, because of a number of circumstances, not that we necessarily will have very cold weather this October, but that there is a pretty high risk that when we get into the early part of the heating season in October, didn't mean to do that, meant to hit my pointer button, that we will get much colder than normal weather over much of the country in October. And I can tell you for sure what will happen if that occurs. And what will happen if that occurs is that the relatively attractive buying opportunity that exists now will disappear in a heartbeat. And some of you may recall conceivably that there was a time, it's 8 years ago now, but there was a time when during the fall, when we suddenly got some early cold weather, natural gas prices doubled in 10 days. I'm not predicting, I would not expect that we'll see anything like that again now. Circumstances are very different, but I think I just mentioned that in order to highlight that there's no question that if we get towards the end of the storage refill season and we suddenly have much colder than normal October weather and much higher than normal space heating demand, you will see two things. You will see, one, a sudden sharp increase in natural gas prices, and two, as one of my friends from GDF Suez put it as we were talking about this before the program went, before, the market will get spooked. And it'll get spooked big time. And so what we'll see is kind of just the tape running in backwards again. We will quickly see winter month prices in particular may quickly escalate very sharply, and even though it doesn't necessarily make sense, we'll probably see something similar for the summer month prices in particular also. And so, this is just, part one of kind of the three substantive parts of the presentation I'm going to give today, but I think hopefully when you step back and look at it from that standpoint, it already should be fairly clear that from a timing perspective, the period between now and the end of September is a pretty important period for all of you. Not just certainly thinking about next winter and the rest of 2015, but even thinking down the road to 16, 17, or even 18. That we could well see a set of circumstances where the forward curves many years out in time go up significantly, and if we're right about some of the other risk factors that I'm going to go into in a minute, potentially creating some significant longer-term upward pressure, we may or may not see prices drop to the levels that we're seeing right now. And we're likely, we think we may even see more attractive prices in early September or mid-September. but this may be one of those periods where if you act now, you can significantly reduce your long-term risk exposure, and if not, it's possible that you'll regret that decision later, because your exposure to some of the price risks I'm going to identify will clearly increase. So that's part of the message about what we think is the near-term buying opportunity. As I said, the patterns that I've just described are strongly suggestive. They don't necessarily solely by themselves say that the opportunity to buy at fairly favorable prices now is compelling. We think you have to step back and look at other factors, but when you step back and look at other factors, we think it becomes even more compelling. And I'm going to divide the rest of the discussion basically into two parts. And the first part is I'm going to talk about kind of what really happened last winter and what does it teach us about the future. Essentially, we think the exposure to price spikes that we saw last winter has been there for several years, and we think it simply was masked by the fact that we had a couple of relatively mild, a very mild winter 2 winters ago, and a fairly normal winter the winter thereafter. The winter weather is obviously is the single most important factor that affects pricing in the winter months, but it ripples through the entire 12-month cycle, because the swings in natural gas demand, natural gas prices tend to drive electricity, and the swings in natural gas demand and therefore in natural gas prices are affected more by winter weather than any other single factor. And you can see that very dramatically in what's actually happened with the winter month storage withdrawals that have occurred over the last 3 cycles. We had just around 1.5 TCF withdrawn in the winter of 2011-12. We had 2.2 the next winter, and we had 3 TCF in this past winter, the all-time record high. And so we've seen actually just over the last 3 years a swing in winter withdrawals and driven by changes in winter demand that's 1.5 TCF. That's essentially on the order of just spread out over a whole year. It's still 4.5 BCF a day. And so that kind of swing is obviously going to have a huge impact in the market. And we think that the risk that we'd have a winter like we had last winter, a winter that was much colder than normal, was there all along. But even more significantly, what last winter did is that it identified a number of other risk factors that did exist previously, but had not previously been revealed in the same sort of way. Now, what are the lessons from last winter? One, it was an exceptionally cold winter. One, might be tempted to say, and it's probably true, that we're not likely to have winters that are quite as cold in the future. But let me qualify that in 2 important respects. One is we're losing a lot of generating capacity, particularly in PJM, and we don't necessarily have to have a winter that's quite as cold as last winter in order to have exposure to the same severity of price spikes in future years. Two, the potential that we actually will have extremely cold winters in 16, 17, 18 actually may be higher than is generally recognized. And I'm going to get into something that's a little bit esoteric here, but I actually think it's something that has to be taken fairly seriously, which is that one of the most important factors that affects severity of winter weather and temperatures generally is basically sunspots, and because they involve major shifts in how much radiation, how much energy is beaming from the sun down to the earth. And when you look at what's actually happening, we have more data about sunspots than most other things. It goes back to Galileo. We have more than 400 years of records. And what it shows pretty consistently is that when we have a high incidence of solar flares, that temperatures on Earth tend to be hotter, and when we have a very low incidence, temperatures turn out to be colder. Well, and we have a lot of data about the pattern. And what they show is that there's a consistent general pattern of periods where there's a high number of sunspots and then a lower number of sunspots. Well, we're in a cycle now where when we were at the high point, it was the lowest high that we've had in 100 years, and we're tracking a pattern that suggests that there's actually a potential for the lowest low over in the winters of 16, 17, and 18 than we've had in over 400 years. And I don't want to over-exaggerate the importance of that because it's not it's not something that is fully and rigorously understood, but it actually, I think, is a fairly significant risk factor that I would want to be worried about in thinking about what might happen in future winters. And I've actually take this seriously enough that I've spoken to some of the top climatologists in the world about this, and they've all validated that, it's tempting to assume that the next 5 years will be more or less like the last 5 years, or at least more or less like the last 20 years. But that isn't necessarily the case. It actually could be very different, and it's just another one of those risk factors that's out there that we think is worth being aware of. You all know the extreme cold weather was in a sense, the single most important cause of driving both natural gas and electricity prices higher. We saw that vividly with natural gas, but as you saw before, the spikes where electricity were just as high. I put up, I think I probably went through them too quickly, but I had the equivalents of these graphs for PJM earlier in the slide deck. It wasn't just PJM, it was pretty much everywhere in the Northeast. It was very painful in terms of January prices in 2013 averaged right around $40. In January of last winter, they averaged over 160. February, also very high prices, and probably I suspect all of you remember that very vividly. What's I think was significant about in terms of lessons learned is that what happened is that this very cold weather masked a number of problems that we think weren't fully appreciated previously. One is that essentially what we've clearly seen is that the kind of core underlying demand for natural gas has been increasing every year, and while production of natural gas has been increasing at the same time, the additions of pipelines has not kept pace. And so there's no question one of the most fundamental causes of what happened last winter is that there simply wasn't enough pipeline capacity to simultaneously meet both the space heating demand and the power sector demand that existed in a cold winter. And we think part of what's important to be aware about is that that problem not only could occur, but is likely to reoccur even if next winter weather isn't quite as extreme as it was last winter. Another thing that we learned is that during the worst days, part of what happened was that if you looked at total demand for natural gas and compared it to the new production that was going into the market plus the maximum amount that we could deliver out of storage, that on the most severe days there wasn't enough deliverability capability out of storage to meet demand. And part of what's really kind of a considerable concern for this coming winter is that we're injecting a lot less natural gas into storage this injection season than we have at any time for 5 or 6 years at this point. And so the risk that we won't be able to pull enough natural gas out of storage if we have a cold winter is clearly pretty greater this coming winter than it was last winter. And another factor that was absolutely critical is the generation outages that occurred. And many of you have probably seen this data before. This was presented at a FERC conference, but basically in PJM, on the worst day, we had almost a quarter of all the generating units in PJM weren't able to operate. And the reason for that was partly the problem of natural gas, not having enough natural gas pipeline capacity to serve both residential space heating demand and power sector demand for natural gas during very cold weather. But it was also because as many coal-fired plants are nearing the point at which they're likely to be retired, they aren't being maintained nearly as well. And as a result of that, when they were stressed by cold weather, there was an unprecedented incidence of outages at coal-fired plants. And so it was all these combination of factors that led to these price spikes. And unfortunately, they're near term. Over a period of years, they might improve. But when we look at next winter and the winter thereafter and the winter after that, these conditions probably are generally going to get worse rather than better. And so I'll be glad to answer questions later about the specifics of this, but the broad point for present purposes is this is another factor that in our mind, highlights that the potential for further price spikes and this in the next 2 or 3 winters, it remains very significant. And when you look at where future prices are now, they're down, at a level that's less than half of what actual prices were last winter, and they're getting relatively close to what they were before any of these problems really surfaced. And it's that combination of circumstances that is part of what, from our standpoint, suggests that this is really an important time to be looking at covering your positions further out in time. The other set of factors that we think strongly supports kind of the same conclusion is basically, I won't try to cover all of this because I want to try to stay on schedule, but essentially we are seeing many other major changes that are occurring simultaneously. And maybe I'll just highlight 2 for now, and then we'll stop and try to allow at least a little bit of time for questions. The 2, I'm going to actually start here, and then I'll move backwards for a minute. The 2 risk factors that I would like to highlight the most for present purposes are what's likely to occur with respect to coal plant retirements, and then also the increases that are going to be occurring down the road in natural gas demand and what that might do to natural gas prices. Let me start first with the issue of coal-fired plant retirements, which we think is particularly critical issue for PJM. And if you look at what's happening, we already know that really because of a combination of coal plants continuing to age and what lower natural gas prices have done for the economics of older coal-fired plants, and because of some of the EPA requirements that are already on the books, particularly what's called the MATS rule, the Mercury and Air Toxics rule, that goes into effect on April 15th of 2015. And it's been talked about for years, but we're actually going to see a large number of retirements, and that's, I guess, a little over 6 months from now. We're going to see nationwide, and particularly in PJM, due to the combination of those factors, a whole huge block of retirements. And those are really, we've already actually seen very substantial coal retirements over the last 4 years. And to some extent, in the last 2 or 3 summers, the effect of that has been masked by the combination of mild weather, relatively mild weather, particularly this summer, and the availability of natural gas. We're now going to see, even just with the laws that are already in the book, a huge jump in coal-fired retirements, with a big block of them in PJM occurring April 15th. A lot of those are locked in at this point, and then additional retirements in 2016 and 2017 that are going to bring us up to at least 23,000 megawatts of coal-fired plants that have been operating through all of our lifetimes, that have been a core source of power in PJM, that are going to disappear soon. And we think, based upon a much more detailed analysis, that particularly for this summer of 2015, summer of 2016, that is going to significantly increase vulnerability to summer price spikes. And those plants will be around this coming winter. They don't have to shut down until April, but they won't be around in the winter of 2015, 2016. So we think that will significantly increase winter price spikes as well. And that's really just the beginning. And I only talk about it briefly now, but basically I do think in terms of risk factors, it's important to highlight the Obama administration's proposed carbon rule. And this is a rule the proposed rule was only issued at the beginning of the summer on June 2nd. It got some substantial attention, but it's very complex, so it's not all that well understood. What I would say for present purposes, I want to emphasize 2 or 3 things. One is the Obama administration is dead serious about going forward with this rule. And so I think it's the likelihood that it is going to go into effect is very high. And while it will be litigated, it's relatively unlikely that the court that has jurisdiction will prevent it from going into effect. So I think the odds are pretty high that we're going to see a rule adopted and that it will go into effect. The second thing is there's something very different about this than previous proposals relating to carbon. And that is, as some of you may remember, when Obama was elected, restricting CO2 emissions from power plants was a huge issue. He was very clear when he was elected that his #1 priority was health care. More than a few people, I think with some justification, thought it should have been jobs, but his #1 priority was health care, and his #2 priority was climate change. And the administration did in fact fight very hard for 2 years to try to get climate change legislation adopted by Congress. And it ultimately failed. And it failed even though when it was seeking legislation, it recognized that to have any chance of getting legislation passed, it would have to, from its standpoint, compromise a great deal and give in on a lot of issues where it wanted to be tougher, and it still failed. What's happened now is very different. Essentially what happened is that after the legislation failed in 2009 and 2010, people went back to square one and people in the White House and elsewhere to figure out, okay, if we can't get legislation passed, what else can we do? And they've now come up, the core of what the Obama administration has proposed is basically that they have found a somewhat obscure provision in the existing Clean Air Act. It's called Section 111D, which they are now using as the basis for their proposed rule. And that provision does have some pretty broad language in it, and there's a pretty credible argument that what they're doing is consistent with the statute. But the important point for present purposes is that it's something that they have proposed doing that does not require legislation. And so it's not the kind of situation it was in 2009 and 2010. It's in this situation in particular, most people believe that basically, even whether Congress likes this or not, and there are a lot of people in Congress who are adamantly, vehemently opposed to this, that there's probably nothing that Congress can do to stop it. And secondly, because of that, and because this is being proposed at the end of Obama's tenure as president, they're really, from the perspective of the White House, there's no reason to compromise in the way they did from their perspective in 2009 and 2010. And so there is every likelihood that not only that this rule will be adopted, but that it'll be a pretty tough rule. And that has a huge amount of significance. I'm not trying to say that it will lead to runaway electricity prices. I don't think it will. But what I am saying is that it's clearly a major change, and it's a major change that I think kind of almost everyone believes will result in some meaningful increase in prices for electricity and potentially a very significant increase in demand for natural gas. And it is basically not priced into the market at all right now. So it is another major risk factor that's out there that we think has to be taken very seriously, that we think is not built into the forward curves for electricity in particular over the next several years, and is important to take into account in your procurement decisions. Now, one might say at first blush that the proposal, even if it's tough, isn't intended to go into effect for several years. And so one might say, well, let's not worry about it near term. It's more a long-term problem. But actually, when you look at the analysis that EPA has actually done, they've had some extensive modeling work done by a consulting firm called ICF Consulting that's kind of one of the gold standards in the area of doing this kind of modeling of the power markets. And that study actually predicts that if the proposal is adopted as it's currently formulated, that it will potentially result in the retirement of an additional 24,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation almost immediately. And why would a rule that doesn't go into effect for several years potentially have an immediate impact like that? The reason is essentially if you're the owner or operator of a coal-fired plant, essentially you have to put a lot of money in that plant to keep it up and running. And that's particularly true with a lot of plants which have still not made a final decision about whether to retrofit pollution controls under the mercury and air toxics rule or some of the existing requirements. And if you're the owner of one of those plants and you're in the process of trying to decide whether you will put potentially several $100 million of additional capital into a power plant, the EPA proposal has a really major effect because it really says basically that if you go ahead and make that investment now, that essentially you may only be able to operate the plant for another 4 or 5 years. Or even if you're allowed to continue to operate it longer term, you may have to, your operating costs may go way up. You may have to buy carbon allowances or something like that, and your profit margins may go way down. And so there is actually a very significant risk that even though this law doesn't go into effect, wouldn't go into effect, this rule wouldn't go into effect immediately, that it would in fact have a major impact on coal-fired retirements as early as a year and a half from now. And so that's, when we look at these factors in terms of coal plant retirements and the other environmental requirements, they are really major big picture factors that tell us, you're better off when there's a favorable opportunity to lock in prices that don't yet price in these factors. It's important to take advantage of those opportunities. And kind of the last point I'll make before moving on to questions is that there's something else in the works that we think is not yet fully priced into the market that's really very significant as well. And that is, essentially what we're seeing now is a delayed reaction to the shale revolution and to the drop in natural gas prices that's occurred over the last several years. And what the delayed reaction is that we really saw natural gas prices start to fall really sharply about 3.5, 4 years ago now. And when that initially happened, a lot of people were skeptical. Were prices going to be, was this going to be a really major change, or was this something that was really just short term? And so people, potential natural gas users waited for a couple of years to see whether the changes that were occurring were for real. And as all of you are familiar, there's no question we've seen a step down in natural gas prices. And after that persisted for a couple of years, a lot of people, all at the same time, started to make investment decisions that reflected this drop that was occurring in natural gas prices. And those included people who were thinking about building gas-fired power plants, and those included industrial manufacturers in natural gas-intensive industries. And those included, I actually been in Mexico City a couple of times just over the last 3 or 4 weeks. It included the Mexican government that decided that they really ought to tap the availability of low-cost natural gas in the U.S. in order to help stimulate economic growth in Mexico. And it included potential LNG purchasers from all over the world who were worried about where they would get additional LNG longer term. And really, essentially, starting about 2 or 3 years ago, at more or less the same time, all these different potential natural gas users reached the conclusion with some justification that the shale revolution was for real, and they all decided about the same time that they would start going forward with major projects that would use U.S. natural gas. And as a result, one of the things that is highly predictable, that again we don't think is fully priced into the market, is, I'm not sure whether all of you can see this well or not, but this is cumulative increase in demand for natural gas produced in the U.S. And what it'll show is that we've been seeing over the last few years some modest increase in total demand for natural gas produced in the U.S. But that starting in 2016 and 2017, it is going to zoom. And that we're going to see unprecedented increases in demand for natural gas produced in the U.S. And again, it's not any one factor, it's the fact that there are all these factors combined. The single most important, though, is LNG exports. The world market is going to need a lot more LNG. And what has happened just over the course of the last 24 months is that we've moved from a situation where the U.S. was not an LNG exporter to a situation where it's clear that the best source for LNG in the future is going to be buying it from LNG export plants in the United States. And that's happening worldwide. What's actually happening just over the last 12, 24 months is that projected future demand for LNG has been growing, and at the same time it's become clear that the U.S. projects are lower cost and lower risk than projects anywhere else in the world. And so essentially all over the world, plans to build LNG export facilities in other parts of the world have been put on hold. And all over the world, LNG purchasers are turning to the U.S. for their future supply. And that alone, the LNG export plants are enormous. The first plant that's being built, Cheniere's Sabine Pass project, uses about as much natural gas as 20 huge power plants just at the one facility in Sabine Pass, and there may be 10 or more that come in line during the period starting a little bit in 2016, but particularly 2017 and 18 and beyond that. And so those are likely to lead to a huge increase in demand, and that's going to occur at the same time. I can tell you from my own experiences working with the Mexican government right now, there already has started to be a big increase in exports of U.S. natural gas to Mexico that's going to just explode, and it's going to explode even more quickly. There are also about $100 billion of new industrial facilities being built in the Gulf region to use U.S. natural gas, so et cetera. We're going to have this huge increase in demand. Now, what does that mean in terms of risk exposure? I personally believe that, I'm reasonably well convinced, that in the end, we have all the resources we need to meet even a huge increase in demand, in the sense that there's enough natural gas in the ground so that if the market were perfectly efficient and we had a perfect plan, we could in fact increase production pretty rapidly. But I also believe, in terms of risk analysis, that in the real world, essentially, the likelihood that demand will grow this rapidly is becoming very high, and that there is a very high risk that for a period of a number of years, when we're seeing unprecedented increases in U.S. demand for natural gas, demand for natural gas will grow more rapidly than supply. And so I think while that eventually the market can handle these increases in demand, when we look further out in the decade, this is another major risk factor, basically, that demand grows very rapidly, that increases in production will lag that to some degree, and I'm even more concerned that increases in building pipelines will lag that even more, and that could result in some pretty significant increases in natural gas prices at the same time that all these coal plants are being retired, and at the same time that reserve margins are declining in a lot of regions, and at the same time potentially that will remain exposed to extreme weather events. And so these are very complex issues, and I appreciate all your attention, and I've obviously only been able to talk about them at a certain level in the presentation today. There's a lot more that can be said, and some important nuances and qualifications that I haven't talked about. They're the sort of things that we do try to analyze in a fair amount of depth in the energy risk reports that we publish, and they're definitely factors that we try to take into account in a very rigorous way in the conclusions they reach. But the bottom line is, again, that if you look, we think that both very near term, because of the drop in prices that's occurred because of the mild summer, and further down the road, that there are a lot of price risk in the market that are not yet being fully priced in. We're not alone in saying that. In PJM in particular, Andrew Ott, who's one of the senior officials at PJM, has said a number of times now publicly, it doesn't necessarily make the headlines, but that he believes that the futures curve is not yet reflecting the risk associated with all these factors. The bottom line is that we really think this is a critical time period and that it is really important to think about these long-term risks and to adjust your procurement strategy accordingly. Now, why don't I stop there? I've probably already gone a little longer than I should have, but why don't I try to take at least 2 or 3 questions, and then we have one of my colleagues is outside. If you give her your business card, we'll be glad to send you a sample of the analysis we do and of the reports that we do, and glad to answer any specific questions that we can't get to now. Why don't we try to allow time for at least a couple of questions right here. Give me my chance to say that I've had a press conference in Citizens Bank Park.
If you have a question, I'll bring you the mic just so we can get it in our recording. So, yes.
Yeah, hi. So, what are your thoughts on the use of demand response technologies to lower risk by generating savings as well as market revenue?
Well, I think the short answer for present purposes would be, on the one hand, there's no question that demand response can be extremely powerful way to deal with exposure to price spikes. I actually personally have made some significant investments in trying to promote demand response technologies about a decade ago, unfortunately a little bit too early, but precisely because I think it's potentially very potent. The question that probably most of you are aware of is fundamentally, will all of the demand response that's been bid into the capacity market in PJM actually be available when it's called upon? And I think the proof will be in the pudding, one way or the other. I think there are clearly a significant risk. I mean, as most of you are probably familiar, what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years when PJM has held its capacity auctions, there's been a huge amount of demand response that's been bid into the market, and there have now been some limitations on the extent to which that's allowed, but a pretty high percentage of the incremental resources that have been bid into the PJM capacity market have consisted of demand response resources. And so, whether the market works efficiently and whether we have adequate resources is actually very highly dependent upon whether all this demand response is going to be available when called upon. And on the one hand, frankly, as someone who does believe that it can be an extremely cost-effective resource, there's no doubt in my mind that a substantial portion will be available. And on the other hand, there's no question that there's a significant risk that significant blocks of demand response won't be available. We just won't know until that's fully tested. Up until now, we've had very high reserve margins, in part because we had all these coal-fired units operating. In the future in PJM, as these coal plants are retired, the reserve margins, even on paper, are going to go way down. And when I say on paper, that's even if you fully count all the demand response resources that have been bid into the market. If it turns out that, in fact, any significant block of them just don't respond, aren't available when they're called upon, then we have a really serious problem, and then we have even more exposure to price spikes than what I've outlined previously. So it's a complex issue, and I wouldn't want to give a black and white answer. I think for present purposes, all I'd want to do is to highlight that essentially all the pricing that you see and all the projections about reserve margins essentially assume that demand response will work exactly how it's hoped to work. And if it doesn't, that's a pretty significant risk factor.
late 2000s, people signed 3 and 4 year contracts for electricity. And as you demonstrated earlier, in 2011, kind of really the market dropped significantly. So how do you sell to senior management that they should be locking up contracts for 17 and 18 when you've got the history of the late 2000s of those people being burned at a much higher price by signing long-term deals?
Well, I'm going to say this. I'm going to give you an initial semi-facetious response, but I'll then try to give you a more serious response. The semi-facetious response is, please subscribe to my report, because really the whole purpose behind the energy risk report, really more than anything else, is to provide kind of a rigorous, well-defended analysis of what the price risks are. So both as an aid to all of you in your decision making, but also very specifically to give documentation from what we like to think is a well-regarded source as to the basis for this kind of recommendation. I say that only semi-facetiously. We happen to think we have one of the best sources of information about the market, but that's for you to judge on your own. Although again, please do leave a card and we'll send you a sample report. But the more serious answer is really that essentially it does depend on the fundamentals, and whether you get the information from us or from someone else, we think it's a question of pulling together that documentation. If you look at the 2009 kind of time frame, again, I stand by our track record actually in terms of being able to anticipate shifts in the market. If you go back to that time frame, natural gas prices had been soaring, that had been driving up electricity prices, et cetera. And there were many, many people who were very skeptical about whether the shale revolution was for real. And what we did is that we dove into it. I was fortunate, in particular, Aubrey McClendon, who was one of the subscribers to our publication, who was kind of the champion of the shale revolution back in that time frame, knew that I had been one of the first to predict that natural gas prices would go way up at the beginning of the decade. And so he thought it would be helpful if he could try to convince me that the shale revolution was for real. And he invited me out to Oklahoma City and let me cross-examine for a day his entire senior operating staff, starting with Steve Dixon, who was the chief operating officer down, who ran all their development activities on down. And the evidence was there that that costs for natural gas were going to go way down. And based upon that evidence, it was predictable, actually, that there was a really good chance that we'd see some significant downward price movement. It just was a question of having to dive deeply and have the right sources of information. And now the fundamentals have changed, and in the same way that we not only were able to figure out but could document the changes that were likely to occur that would move prices lower during the time frame you referred to, now we think by pulling together the right information that it can be documented to the senior management of your company and others, that this is an important time where there's significant risk. And frankly, I personally feel passionately enough about it so that if after you analyze the issues further, you want to make a recommendation to that effect to your management, give me a call and I'll be glad to sit down. And I'm being completely straight up on this. I think, there's a lot at stake with these procurement decisions, and the markets are complex. What has been, it's painfully clear to me in the work I've done over the last 10 or 15 years is just how much being exposed to price increases and not being able to protect against that, how much damage that can do to your companies. And so I really feel passionately about trying to do whatever small part I can to try to help significant energy users like all of you in the room to try to convince your management of the importance of protecting against exposure to the kind of price risk that I've described. Yeah. Kathleen, one more maybe? Or
I'm glad you got back to the natural gas pricing and you've your comments about the price risk in the market. Can you quantify that for us in terms of, you know, what are you forecasting? What are you predicting the increases in pricing could be in natural gas in 2016, 17, 18?
Well, let me start by saying, you know, we, in terms of natural gas prices, the starting point from our perspective is that weather has a tremendous impact, and that the answer to the question of what that, you know, it's, I think all of us would like to be in a situation where there's only one, that one can give a specific dollar amount as to what could happen with natural gas prices, but we think that it has to be looked at differently, and specifically has to be looked at what could happen with natural gas prices under different scenarios, particularly regarding the weather. And so the way I would answer your question is essentially what will happen to natural gas prices will depend on whether we're lucky. And if we're lucky and we wind up having sufficiently mild weather, we could, you know, definitely in 2016 or 2017, prices could be near the level that they are now. On the other hand, we think what is actually more likely to happen is that basically the prices will be low enough near term to kind of slow down to some extent the drilling, that the market won't anticipate be quick enough to anticipate the increases in demand, and that if we have cold weather in the winters or a very hot summer, that there will be very significant price exposure. Now, in terms of what that means in terms of dollar levels, you know, basically the issue is sort of the same one that we saw this winter. And I just again try to keep it relatively simple, but essentially we've been almost always over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been, let's say, in a box or within certain parameters where essentially there was enough natural gas supply so that whenever there were shortages, we could adjust to them just by ratcheting back the utilization of the gas-fired plants and ratcheting up the utilization of the coal-fired plants. And that kept prices basically between, let's say, $3 and $4.50. And the question then will become what the risk is that we break out of that box. And I'd say there, you know, I think clearly is a significant risk. If I had to quantify it, maybe a 20% chance that by 2016, 2017, what would happen is basically what actually happened in this past winter. That we get into a period, fortunately this past winter it was only temporary, but we get into a situation where the market can't balance just by using this adjustment mechanism of using less gas and more coal. And when that happens, the whole dynamic of the market changes a great deal. And we're exposed to what happened to this winter, that prices could easily go up 50% based upon what in the end is a relatively small imbalance between supply and demand. And I'm trying to find a way to articulate this hopefully both clearly and quickly, and maybe struggling a little bit to do that. But I'd say we're in 2016 and 2017, we're likely to be in a fragile situation where essentially if we're lucky with the weather, we'll still be in that box. But if we get, if there turn out to be the 70,000 megawatts of coal plant retirements that ICF says will occur if the climate change rule goes into effect, and it turns out that we have a cold winter, we could easily break out of that box, and prices could go to 650, 750 very quickly, just as they did in February in the middle of this past winter. And so I think there's, in my mind, there's no question that there is exposure to that kind of price risk. I want to be clear about it. We're kind of, that doesn't by itself say to me, go out tomorrow and cover all your natural gas requirements for the indefinite future. What it says is that, first of all, that's one of the risk factors that's out there, that it could be that steep. And that's one of the reasons where if we're in a period like we're in now, where prices are fairly reasonable, please follow a portfolio approach. Please try to cover at least some meaningful block of your requirements now when we know prices are relatively attractive relative to even the most favorable case that can exist. It also says to me that to the extent that you leave your requirements open for 2016 and 2017, you have to be really careful in the way you monitor the market, that the exposure to these upside risks will be pretty high, and you need to do the kind of analysis basically that we try to do in our publication in order to, it becomes particularly important in that circumstance to be aware of when you need insurance, when you might benefit by buying insurance, and that it'll become even more important as a result of that to really follow the market carefully, to really look at weather risks, to be able to analyze with a fair amount of precision what will happen to prices if the weather winds up being unfavorable rather than favorable, and to be prepared to pull the trigger fairly quickly to cover your remaining requirements if in fact things start to unfold in a way that increases your price risk. I would like to be able to give you a more pinned down answer than that. It's the best I can do kind of quickly under this circumstance, but I really do think it ultimately boils down to having that a real important part of the answer is that price risks are really going to increase significantly over the years, that the way to deal with that is partly a portfolio approach, but it's also partly by having a sophisticated framework in place in order to be able to identify those risks, anticipate those risks before they get out of control, and buy insurance when you need to. If you'd like to talk about it more when we're upstairs, I'd be glad to do that, but that's at least my best first shot effort at trying to answer your question. Should we, Kathleen, are we at the point you didn't quite give me the so, but, so that was, I appreciate you being polite.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so in closing, thank you very much for coming today and also for participating and asking questions. It was a great session, and what we're going to do next is we're going to move on to oh, actually I got to finish up we are recording this session, as you heard earlier. So what we're going to do is we'll send out a link once it is available. We'll send it out to you, both the recorded session as well as the slides, so you will have that. So again, thank you for your participation here today. Okay, so now that